Hello, Kevin here with Notes on Iowa, and today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about part one, day 4 of my walk across Iowa, following in the footsteps of the 1835 Iowa Dragoons expedition. And on part 1, day 4, I went from Leando, Douds, up Eagle Drive to the small town of Selma, or Hickory, or Independent, or Stumpville. It's been called a lot of things over the course of its history since the 1800s, on through Iowaville, and then eventually on up to Eldon, the site of the American Gothic house. So come with me as we take a look at part 1, day 4, Leando, Douds to Eldon. So, part 1, day 4, I started out Douds, Leando, and for more on those, take a look at the article or the video that I posted about part 1, day 3. But I started up Eagle Drive, heading up the south bank of the river towards the small town of Selma. Now, one of the interesting things about Selma is it wasn't always Selma. The earliest maps we have of kind of related to American settlement there refer to the town as Independent, but people there didn't even call it that. They called it either Stumpville or Stumptown, after the town's first postmaster, who's also the U.S. government survey representative that laid out the town. Eventually, the town was changed to Hazel or Hazelton, and then eventually passed on to being called Selma. Nobody's exactly sure when or why that change occurred. But as I approached on my walk up the river, I ran into a canoe access just to the north of the bridge, and was able to put the drone up despite the rain and get a little bit of footage kind of overlooking the river at that point before crossing over into the small town of Selma. The town itself, not a ton going on today. There's a small winery there. There's a historic park with a reconstructed log cabin. Otherwise, though, I didn't spend a ton of time there, and I started trudging up Highway 16. And one of the things I almost missed was the Iowaville Cemetery. This is a really important site. It's relatively unmarked, but if you go up the hill and start looking through the different grave sites that are there, one of the memorials you're going to find is for the famous Sauk chief Blackhawk. Now, Blackhawk you may be familiar with because of the Black Hawk War. If you haven't looked into that at all, I would really encourage you to take a look at the autobiography of Chief Blackhawk, or Carrie Trask's great book on Blackhawk, The Battle for the Heart of America. But today there's a marker there, and there's a lot of controversy surrounding Blackhawk's remains and his burial. He was undoubtedly buried initially and then stolen by a local doctor who eventually gave his remains to the then territorial governor of the state of Iowa, who eventually either gave them to another doctor or donated them to a historical society where the building burned down. But in reality, it's still a mysterious controversy. If you're a person that loves to look into unsolved mysteries, that'd be a great Iowa history one to solve. As you leave the Iowaville Cemetery, I started looking for the town of Iowaville, which I knew existed because it's on all of the earliest maps. It's in all of the accounts from people like Albert Lee with the Dragoons, people like Joseph Street running the agency, all those kind of things, and very kind of important tribal site where the Iowa had a large village. Eventually they were attacked by the Dakota and or the Sauk and Meskwaki, eventually leaving the area. And part of our Indigenous past that maybe we need to take a closer look at and discuss. I didn't see anything related to the site. People have told me there's a small sign on a barn there. But one of the things that I'm really passionate about, you can see my recent article in Annals of Iowa, you can see any of my past work, is putting Indigenous people into the past of Iowa in a way that makes sense and is truly representative. As I headed up the road away from kind of those sites, I eventually passed in Davis County from Van Buren County. I'd walked all the way across Van Buren County and eventually came to see an interesting site. In 2009, the Lock Keeper's house was put on the National Register of Historic Places. And this is another thing I didn't expect to see on my journey that day. This is a 1.5-story stone structure that was actually a legacy of the Des Moines Improvement and Navigation Company's failed attempts to tame the river. They intended to build a lock and dam near Eldon at the site of the Lock Keeper's house, but those plans never materialized as railroads eventually passed steam as the predominant form of transportation during the time period. On up the river, though, you can see where railroads really played a difference. In Eldon, which is a town that's much later founded than some of the others I passed through early on my journey and didn't come around and wasn't platted until 1872. That relates to Iowa Railroad history. When the railroad arrived there, Eldon became a major crossroads for a couple of different railroads. And the Depot Museum there today is still a great representation that does a wonderful job preserving the past of that legacy for the town of Eldon. Most people who have heard of Eldon have heard of it because of the American Gothic house. This is one of 8 sites maintained throughout Iowa by the Iowa Department of Cultural Affairs, and they do a wonderful job at all of their sites of continuously improving their interpretation, making sure sites are well maintained, and you can really see that at the American Gothic site today. The house itself is lovely. You've probably seen the famous Grant Wood painting, or for sure parodies of it. It's been on everything from neckties to socks to political cartoons, all those kind of things. See American Gothic. But today you can go and you can visit the house. There's a great interpretive center there. And a real highlight and really well done job of communicating public memory, both celebrating Grant Wood as well as talking about regionalism and art in Iowa, all those kind of things you can find at the American Gothic site. Also, you can take your own picture there, have the opportunity, and here you can see Marissa and I doing our best impression despite no pitchfork and having our rain gear on because, once again, like most of the other days of the first part of our expedition, it rained. So that marked the end of part 1, day 4, where we went from Leando Douds up to Eldon. Saw some really interesting, thought-provoking sites along the way that made us think about public memory and how we're remembering different parts of Iowa's past, particularly Iowa's Indigenous past, and how we're continuing to preserve our shared history. And so a really interesting day. We appreciate you taking the time to watch. As always, I want to remind you that people make this project better all the time. And any feedback you have, any insights you have to different sites we saw or things we might see as we continue in the path of the 1835 Iowa Dragoons across the state, always appreciate it. Feel free to reach out in the comments or via the contact form on the website at notesofiowa.com. Appreciate you taking the time to watch the video. Thanks.